que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Avanzan ya banderas de unidad y tú vendrás marchando junto a mí.
Hoy se cumplen 10 años del inicio de una nueva época en América Latina y en el Caribe.
Apostando por una transformación profunda que empezaron en Cuba, Venezuela, ahora en toda Latinoamérica.
Bolívar desde algún lugar del infinito nos está mirando lleno de orgullo. Su sueño se está haciendo realidad. Esta revolución es un símbolo de victoria, de lucha, de honor, de sacrificio, y tenemos que defenderla.
Y ahora el pueblo que se alza en la lucha con voz de gigante gritando adelante. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será...
Han resistido 20 palos de agua y aquí está el pueblo.
Y la revolución bolivariana, que hoy cumple 10 años, cumplirá también 50 años, porque será el mandato de ustedes.
El mar de pueblo no ha hecho sino crecer.
Es irreversible. Nuestros pueblos han despertado y no darán marcha jamás para atrás.
América Latina hoy se ha liberado del yugo imperialista.
Ilumina el futuro de los pobres, el futuro de la humanidad.
La patria o es una sola y grande o no es.
¡Alerta! ¡Alerta! ¡Alerta que camina! ¡La espada de Bolívar por América!
La conciencia del pueblo, la voluntad del pueblo es lo más sagrado de esta revolución.
¡Nunca dejen de luchar! ¡Nunca se venzan! Que en ustedes esté el espíritu y la fuerza, no solo de Venezuela, sino de Latinoamérica.
Ustedes son el huracán bolivariano.
Esta es una revolución que ni se vende, ni se rinde, jamás.
Al pueblo, lo que es del pueblo. El pueblo, una vez más, tiene razón. Y que viva Simón Bolívar.
¡Patria muerte!
¡Venceremos!
Gracias, hermana. Gracias.
Patria o muerte venceremos. Long live the Troika of resistance, the Bolivarian Revolution of Venezuela, the Cuban Revolution, and the Sandinista Revolution of Nicaragua. Long live all Afro-Indigenous, working class, oppressed peoples of Nuestra America, our America, resisting imperialism, resisting capitalism and colonialism. What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 83, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. And today we're talking about the decolonization of our America, and not America as in the United States, America as in Nuestra America, the Americas Abya Yala, the Americas that belongs to all of the peoples of the Western Hemisphere, in particular the oppressed nations, the Afro-Indigenous nations. And we're going to be talking about the ongoing movements to decolonize from U.S. imperialism, reviewing the 2022 Summit of the Americas held right here in Los Angeles, California, where I'm speaking to you from. We're going to talk about why this summit was bullshit, it was fraudulent, a failure for Washington's grip over Latin America and the Caribbean. And we're also going to talk about the importance of supporting Black and Indigenous national liberation movements in the region, the importance of supporting our sisters and brothers in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, the three countries that were prohibited from attending the Summit of the Americas, and also talking about some of our historical ancestors and some of their knowledge and information that is relevant to the liberation of our peoples today. And joining me today are three amazing comrades, Erica Caines, Salifu, Mack, and Carlos Garrido. Erica is a poet, writer, and organizer in Baltimore and DMV area. She is an organizing committee member of the Anti-War Coalition, Black Alliance for Peace, as well as an outreach member for the Black-centered Ujima People's Progress Party. Erica founded Liberation Through Reading in 2017 as a way to provide Black children with books that represent them. Shout out to BAP, shout out to Ujima, shout out to Liberation Through Reading, and shout out to Erica, who I finally got the chance to meet in LA. How are you doing, Erica? There you go.
I'm good. It was great to meet you. I was very, very excited. So I was happy that you came through.
Yeah, it was awesome getting to see you in person and talk to you, as well as Comrade Salifu, who Comrade Salifu is a Pan-African socialist, editor at Hood Communist, member of the Black Alliance for Peace, the AAPRP, Low Country Action Committee, which is a Black-led grassroots organization dedicated to Black liberation through service, political education, and collective action in the Low Country of South Carolina. Shout out to South Carolina. Salifu also has traveled to Cuba with the IFCO Pastors for Peace on a friendship caravan, bringing medical supplies to Cuba in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. I also got a chance to meet Salifu in person in LA. Really amazing comrades, both you and Erica. Salifu, how's it going back in South Carolina?
Peace, Ramiro. Everything is good, man. It was very, very, very nice to meet you in LA.
Beautiful background, by the way. I love the sky and the area.
Yeah,
South Carolina.
This is low. This is the Low Country. This is the Low Country. It's what everybody needs to see. It's one of the most beautiful places in the U.S., I would say, in my opinion.
Most definitely, yeah. The Carolinas not only have a lot of amazing revolutionary history, but also very scenic background and a lot of organizing. People tend to think the South is very monolithic, like everybody's right wing and conservative, and they don't understand that. In places like South Carolina, North Carolina, you have more Black, Indigenous, immigrant workers who are organizing, and some of the most militant people I know are from the South and the Carolinas. So it's always good to have you on, Salifu. And last but not least, compañero Carlos Garrido, who is a Cubano, a comrade, compañero, editorial board member, and co-founder of Midwestern Marx and the Journal of American Socialist Studies. He is also a philosophy professor and graduate student at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Carlos, how is it going, man?
What's up, Ramiro? Thanks for having me on. I love your show, as I've stated before. So it's a pleasure to be on, as always, with such great guests as well. And I think the topic couldn't be any more important. I think we're experiencing a new moment, so it's really good to discuss and reflect on what it is that we're seeing in the changing political reality of Latin America and the hemisphere.
Well, most definitely. And shout out to Midwestern Mark, shout out to Comrade Eddie and everybody at Midwestern Marks. Shout out to Steven Tremino, shout out to Ill State Fishing, to BAP, to Manny Nile, to everybody who's watching, listening, to David Silberg. You guys are regulars here, and I really appreciate you watching and supporting and talking about this very important topic, because it's something that in mainstream media, they're making it seem as if this is a huge win for the U.S. and democracy. We're promoting democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean, and nobody is paying attention to Biden. At this point, nobody is even taking him seriously. Nobody's taking the U.S. seriously. Latin America and the Caribbean increasingly moving to the left and becoming more radicalized in every sense, not only the governments that are in power, the people's governments of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, but also the movements that have yet to take power or are still building power in Honduras and Bolivia, in Colombia, in Chile. Chile is kind of an interesting case. We could talk about that some other time. And of course, the popular uprising in Haiti that always is important to bring up, because without the Haitian Revolution, there would be no Latin American revolutions. And the people of Haiti always, since 1804, resisting in the streets, fighting back against plans to recolonize Haiti. And it's beautiful to see so much revolutionary fervor going on, taking place in Latin America and the Caribbean. So what I want to do is I want to just play a clip of some of the mainstream news items recapping the Summit of the Americas, again, taking place here in LA in California, where I'm speaking to you from. And this is a summit, basically. It's a bullshit. It's like the Organization of American States, a Ministry of Colonies, a forum designed for the U.S. to give whipping orders to its subjugated colonies in Nuestra America. And not everybody went. So I'm going to share this clip and we'll talk about what exactly happened and what were some of the counter demonstrations that took place, because those are important too. And I actually just came back from Tijuana, Mexico, just a few hours ago. I'm like on 4 hours of sleep, by the way, everybody. For those of you who can't tell, I'm sleepy as hell, but we're still having this conversation. It came from an amazing, amazing conference of comrades from Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and Mexico, the communist groups of Mexico, who had the Worker Summit of the Americas in Tijuana, in counter to the Bourgeois Summit of the Americas, which I'll talk later about. It was an amazing event. So I'm going to play this clip recapping the Summit of the Americas, and then we'll get right into it.
From across the Western Hemisphere are in Los Angeles this week for the Summit of the Americas. Last night, President Biden unveiled a new economic plan to help respond to the region's most pressing challenges: migration, climate change, and the pandemic. But these issues have been overshadowed by disagreements over who should participate. Here's John Yang.
In a city where the drama is usually on the big screen and velvet ropes are the norm, who's not at the Summit of the Americas is as much of the story as the gathering itself. Designed to be a show of hemispheric unity for almost the last 30 years, there's been discord over the guest list. Citing concerns over a lack of democracy, this year the host United States barred 3 nations.
One of the key elements of this summit is democratic governance. And these 3 countries are not exemplars, to put it mildly, of democratic governance.
Not invited, Cuba, with its nearly 65-year history of communism, Venezuela, where Nicolas Maduro has tightened his grip on power, and Nicaragua, where former Marxist Daniel Ortega was declared winner of his 4th consecutive election after jailing his rivals. In response, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico, the U.S.'s second-largest trading partner, refused to attend.
I believe we need to change the policy that has been imposed for centuries, a policy of exclusion and dominance that disregards the sovereignty of other countries.
The presidents of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are also skipping the meeting. Still, President Biden is unbowed, speaking last night of cooperation, not exclusion.
No longer is this a question of what will we do, what will the United States do for the Americas. The question is what we can accomplish by working together.
Migration in the region is at unprecedented levels. More than 5 million Venezuelans are displaced across Latin America. Migrants from around the world cross the Colombia-Panama border, and a crisis continues to unfold at the U.S.-Mexico border. They're fleeing political and economic instability and a new wave of anti-establishment and authoritarian leaders. At the summit, Panama's foreign minister spoke for many.
What is happening in democracy is that there's a lot less trust in our leaders. The same thing is happening in all countries.
The Americas have also been devastated by natural disasters and the aftermath of the pandemic, another focus of this year's summit.
So let's use this summit to tackle the obstacles to growth. Come together around new ideas and new opportunities to take our region's biggest challenges on and defeat them.
But as the summit goes on, the diplomatic controversy is at the forefront, and the future of U.S. influence in the region uncertain.
So there you have it, a recap of the bourgeois summit of the Americas. And it's interesting because I think one of the biggest developments, I think this was huge, first of all, not the summit, but the decision of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the president of Mexico, to not attend, to boycott it. And mind you, this is in LA, which is occupied, stolen land from Mexico and indigenous communities, and has the largest Mexican population and borders Mexico. And this is the main artery, the main organ of U.S. imperialism, the first subjugated Latin American nation of U.S. imperialism, Mexico, after the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And he boycotted it. He said, I'm not going to that conference because everybody isn't invited. And say what you want about AMLO. You know, I have everybody on the left. We have our critiques of him. You know, as a communist, maybe we don't think that he's doing everything that he can be. But I think that was an excellent move to be in solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And very monumental because Mexico is a huge, huge player in the region. Once Mexico is aligning more with the anti-imperialist camp, that signals a big defeat for U.S. imperialism. So we'll start off with Comrade Erica. I met you at an amazing forum hosted by the Black Alliance for Peace. Shout out to BAP. Please subscribe and support BAP's work in LA, talking about the importance of supporting anti-colonial and Black-led resistance in Latin America and the Caribbean, and why it's important to have support for these nations against empire. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the event, like what you did in LA and some of the counter actions that were going on?
Yeah. So the actions in LA obviously were counter actions for the Summit of Americas, but they were planned by BAP's Haiti and the Americas team. We used to be a subcommittee of the Africa team, but we're liberated now. So we have our own team. Last year, we did so much work, not only around Haiti, but Cuba and Colombia and Nicaragua. We had delegations that went to a lot of these countries, Venezuela as well. So we found it very necessary because we are doing a lot of work around getting popular education on SOUTHCOM and getting folks to talk about SOUTHCOM more so that we can open up the conversation for CELAC Zone of Peace. So we found it very necessary to go. And also because we knew people were not going to talk about Africans. Africans were just not centered. And we're the Haiti and the Americas team primarily because we understand Haiti as being like the laboratory for like neocolonialism. So what's done in Haiti is like a testing ground so that they can do it elsewhere. So when we look at how cool, like when we look at the 2004 coup, we could recognize that in Bolivia, the actions of the OAS, the actions of the core group, etc. So it's very important for us to center Haiti to get a better understanding of how the U.S. treats that region, as I guess Biden is saying, his front yard now. So we organized alongside Union del Barrio on Saturday. I co-facilitated, and Jemima Pierre and Austin Cole, who are members of the Haiti Americas team, they were on the panel. So that was about a 6-hour conference. It was really good, though. It was a 2-part conference. We had 2 different panels. and we got to discuss, what is exactly going on in El Salvador, Bolivia, the U.S. hypocrisy about not inviting Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And then the second day, which was Sunday, we premiered our SOUTHCOM video. We also had poster making for folks who were going to attend the march alongside Union Del Barrio and Black Alliance for Peace on Wednesday when Joe Biden was coming. And then we also had a panel discussion that featured myself, Salifu, Dedan Wakori, and our comrade Chris Rendero. And that's where we met you.
Awesome, beautiful stuff. And I also have the video, What is SOUTHCOM? I'm going to play it later on. It's an amazing video. I was blown away by how great, well-produced it was. And I'll play it in a bit, explaining what exactly is SOUTHCOM and the plot to take over the world. They're fucking crazy, the U.S. government. They literally, like the way you guys put it in the forum, like they're literally fucking carving up the world, dividing it up and taking it over. So, people yeah, exactly. And
it's calm now, so
Space Dam, fucking, they're gonna have fucking Starbucks and Mars and shit, in like 5 years. Comrade Salifu, what was your experience like being in LA, taking part in these actions, and also if you want to reflect on your trip to Cuba as well, to talk about what reality is like there, as opposed to what they're saying in mainstream media, that it's a dictatorship, and one of the reasons why they excluded Cuba from the Summit of the Americas.
For sure. Thank you for playing that clip at the beginning. I would say thank you, but also I don't really keep up with mainstream news that much, so like I'm disgusted. Like I'm just disgusted. But man, like we talk about all the time, that's that psychological warfare that our people are up against all the time. Like if all the news that you're getting is what you showed me on that clip, like they have these 3 screens of Maduro, Diaz-Canal, and Ortega describing them like super villains in like a Batman movie or something. Okay, I have to process that out of my mind first. But I'm glad you played that though, because it is a stark contrast to what I would say I observed in LA over the weekend with the actions leading up to the People Summit, because unfortunately I wasn't able to be there for the main events that took place later on in the week, but I was there for what I consider like the pre-show events that BAP took place in, took part in. And man, it was really beautiful, I would say, to see a commitment to anti-imperialism across organizations, across tendencies. I can't speak for exactly who was represented out there, but I feel like the People Summit this weekend was an example of what the U.S. left should invest more in terms of finding principles of unity, finding places where we mesh and can work together, and like rocking and rolling with that, as opposed to sort of like the sectarianism that tends to like pervade social media spaces, and different things like that. At the BAP event that we had, the second panel that I was a part of, where we premiered our SOUTHCOM video, we had a really great conversation, just really explaining to people the basics of what SOUTHCOM is, like how SOUTHCOM operates, really encouraging people to like recenter Haiti. And I feel like in regards to like the political education work that the Haiti and Americas team is trying to do around SOUTHCOM, it's like really fundamental, because when you step outside and you talk to everyday people, a lot of people have never heard of SOUTHCOM before. Like they just never heard of it. They're watching television and they're hearing all these things. They're hearing these people speak in these commercials talking about people fleeing dictatorships and fleeing terrible conditions in their country, and they have no idea what sanctions are, or like how sanctions operate, right? And so like as the US left, as the Western left, it's our responsibility to educate, teach people what these things are and how they they operate. And I felt like that was a lot of what was happening this weekend during the People Summit, just basic level education because once you understand what sanctions are, once you understand how SOUTHCOM is just one part of like a larger sort of piece of the puzzle of the U.S. sort of trying to recolonize the entire world, then you can start to take the news and information that you see with a lot, like with more grains of salt. I don't know how you say it when it's multiple grains of salt, but like with more grains of salt. And I feel like all of that sort of is very near and dear to my heart and important to me, based on the relationships that I've formed in my travels to Cuba, and the people that I've met. What you hear on the news is these descriptions of these countries as this like monolithic place with these horrible policies of repression and suppression. And when you go and you travel and you visit places like Cuba, what you see is very regular people that remind you of like your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, who have dreams, who have aspirations, and who are working every day to make life the best that they can, right, under really dire circumstances that are not about what their governments are doing, but are about combating sanctions and U.S. imperialism. And so, yeah, that's really what I was thinking about and feeling during the summit this weekend.
That's awesome. And by the way, in the video I'll show you guys later what is SOUTHCOM. Comrade Salifu is, I think that you're in that video, right? That's one of your voices.
I'm one of the narrators. You
have a good speaking voice, because if that was me, I'd sound all fucked up. He's featured in the video speaking, and some other comrades, so I'm not too sure exactly, but it's a great video, and I'll show you guys in a bit. And compañero Carlos Garrido, who is a Cuban revolutionary communist based in the U.S., which is an anomaly. If you ask me, a lot of the Cubanos who are in the U.S. unfortunately tend to be very right wing. But yes, there are Cuban communists in the U.S. And what is your take on this huge defeat for U.S. imperialism in terms of like the lack of countries that are boycotting? A lot of countries, the Northern Triangle, right? Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Obviously, El Salvador and Guatemala, for different reasons, boycotted it. They're not necessarily left-wing governments. Bukele, for example, and the Guatemalan president, Xiomara Castro Zelaya, who's to the left, boycotted it in solidarity with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and Mexico as well, AMLO. So you literally have like the main countries where a lot of immigration is coming from not attending it, and just a few tokens who are there. What is your analysis of the summit, and what is next for Latin America and the Caribbean?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a massive failure to have a summit of the Americas where all the heads of states of the people of the America are supposed to be there. And then the leaders of 1/3 of the Americas are not there, right? A whole lot of leaders weren't there, 1/3 of them. So this is just an incredible failure. And one of the other points that just shows the difference that the last 2 decades have made. 20 years ago, the Summit of the Americas was hosted in Mexico, and that's when Vicente Fox, one of the right-wing president at the time in Mexico, he told Fidel, "Comes y te vas," you eat and then get out of here. And look at the difference that 20 years has made in Mexico. I mean, like you said, Ramiro, there's a lot of things with AMLO that we don't agree with, but as a Cuban and as an anti-imperialist, I can't help but see him at the forefront of anti-imperialist struggle, because he was the first one that started the boycott movement before Bolivia. I mean, I love Bolivia. I love the movement towards socialism party. I love the socialist construction over there. And as a Marxist theoretician, I love what they're doing as well. But I mean, the first one to call out the U.S.'s hypocrisy with this summit was AMLO. And he was also the first one last year, in July 11th. We had a conversation about this last year. He was also the first one to send aid to Cuba. Before China, before Bolivia, before anyone else, AMLO was the first one to send aid to Cuba at a really difficult time because of not just the pandemic, but the exploitation of that pandemic by the imperialist forces. So I think that we have to recognize that we're entering, I think, a new movement, a new moment in history, at least for our hemisphere, wherein countries are escaping the bounds of American imperialism and not just escaping them independently, but they're coming together. And that's central to the idea of the Patria Grande that has been at the core of the anti-imperialist thinkers, or at least the best ones in our past.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's really interesting to see the growing momentum for socialism, anti-imperialism in the region. And it's very exciting to see that, because it's something a lot of people said in 2011, 2012, especially after Comandante Chavez died. Like, they were like, oh, it's over. The socialism doesn't work again. And they say that every time stuff like that happens, right? After the Soviet Union, after the pink tide, they were like, it's done, capitalism won. And it's exciting to see the resurgence of socialist, anti-imperialist solidarity in the Americas. And so, just to give you guys a breakdown, so that summit, the Summit of the Americas, took place in LA last week, basically, I think from like Monday to Thursday or something. There was also the People's Summit in response to the Summit of the Americas, which brought together different organizers, activist movements across the country in solidarity with the nations of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And also in Tijuana, Mexico, a few miles away from here, on the other side of the border, there was the Worker Summit of the Americas. I got a chance to go to that. It was an amazing summit. It was hosted at the Universidad de Tijuana by an amazing communist group called the Frente Revolucionario FPR, Frente Proletario Revolucionario, the Proletarian Revolutionary Front, a Marxist-Leninist group in Mexico. And they hosted comrades from Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, union activists, trade leaders, and different representatives, militants of the Sandinista Party, of the PSUV, and the Cuban Communist Party, to talk about building solidarity. So you had people from the US and Canada, but you also had people from Mexico. You also had people from these three nations coming together in Tijuana and talking about building solidarity. There were also comrades from Haiti as well. A really beautiful experience. I'm actually going to post a video of that conference soon. I just have to produce it. I have tons of footage, so I'm going to put that out soon. Amazing, amazing conversations. They were talking about scientific socialism, molding it to the conditions of Latin America and the Caribbean, adopting the ancestral knowledges of Afro-Indigenous peoples of Nuestra America, and synthesizing it with Marxism-Leninism for the 21st century. Just the level of advanced like politics. And it pisses me off when a lot of, in particular, white first world leftists sort of write off our movements in Latin America and the Caribbean as, oh, they're just reformists, or they're not true Marxists or communists, or they don't know what they're talking about. These are serious revolutionaries, serious communists. And what I want to do is I want to show you a clip. This is from today. This is from this morning. These are some comrades who were at the border, because again, Tijuana is right on the border of San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico, where many migrants are forced to stay because of imperialism. And these are comrades who were at the border. These are comrades who were at the border. Let me just explain a little bit.
De Augusto Nicolás Calderón Sandino y de Carlos.
So the comrade who's speaking is my compañero Fausto Torres, who is a Sandinista militant guerrilla. He's a leader of the Friends of the ATC. Shout out to the Friends of the ATC, the Asociación de Trabajadores del Campo in Nicaragua, which builds food sovereignty in Nicaragua. He's a Sandinista leader, well respected, and this is at the border. You see that fence in the back? That is the border. That is the fence right next to the beach. And by the way, that border fence goes into the fucking water, which is nuts. Like, they're fucking crazy, the people who built this wall. So here you have a Cuban flag, a July 26th flag, communist hammer and sickle flags, the FPR, Sandinistas, Venezolanos, Free Alex Saab poster at the U.S. border, at the gates of empire. And I think that Tijuana, and this is what was declared at the conference as well, that Tijuana will continue to grow as the epicenter of the anti-imperialist solidarity internationalist movement in the Americas, because it is at the very gates of hell. It is at the very gates of empire, where you have the most oppressed colonized peoples, Africans from Congo, Haitians, Hondurans, people who have been displaced because of imperialism in Tijuana, gathering with communists from all over the region. So this is, him talking. It's in Spanish, so I'm just going to kind of scroll through some of this. He's talking about like media disinformation on the other side of the border, and how basically they're manipulating people into being against their nations. So very beautiful stuff. Very, very beautiful stuff. This is at the U.S. border. This is Reagan's biggest nightmare of our peoples coming together at the gates and resisting. And I personally believe that Tijuana and Mexico in general will play a very major role in terms of a meeting point of international solidarity. Comrade Erica, your thoughts on all of this, and maybe also if you want to talk about the importance of supporting African Black liberation movements in Latin America, because I think one critique I have of the Latin American left is that not enough attention is given in particular to Haiti, which is the most subjugated nation financially in the Western Hemisphere. Why is it important to defend and raise the national question when we're talking about Latin America?
Right. But also not just Haiti, but we also see Brazil and Colombia, because they're like the second and third largest African regions. So we also center them as important. But it's important because, we're all Africans. So especially when we talk about not to be U.S. centric, that includes the way that we understand Africans in the Americas. Because when we say, that it's our Americas, that we need to have an understanding that Africans do exist there as well, which I think it's convoluted, not just in mainstream, but even projected. When we talk about the race that's going on in Colombia, you're not really seeing a lot of Africans on that from the left. They're looking at more of the indigenous population, the close to white population often, but they're not in Cali. They're not looking at those areas to see what is happening significantly. And I think that's interesting, primarily because Francia is African. And Francia is of the African grassroots movement in Colombia. So I think that's always an interesting takeaway when I watch how the left sort of is galvanizing around the importance of the election, but sort of backing away from the African aspect of that election. And then when you were talking about at Tijuana, we had BAP members from BAP SoCal that went when, the whole controversy with Haitians getting whipped on the border. And a lot of the takeaway, because there were some great connections made, because as you noted, there are a lot of organizations going down there, speaking to people, handing them literature, trying to get folks organized. And they are indeed organizing in their own ways. But you're seeing folks from Haiti organizing with folks from Honduras. You're seeing folks from the Congo, because they're going on hunger strikes and they're trying to find some resolve. So I think that's one of the interesting things that I've seen that's coming out of there. We're supposed to have some comrades go to Tijuana, so I'm glad that you got to experience it at least. I couldn't make it. If I probably would have never left, because there was so much stuff happening. I probably would have never left. But I think the importance of the summit itself and having all these counter summits, because I know Mack Salifu was talking about it being like BAP was sort of initiating that week of counter summits to come. But a lot of the importance of it is because, like, what we just seen in that video that you showed earlier, which was a lot. But again, like Salifu noted, like especially around the summit, I have not paid attention to any of the mainstream news around it. I pretty much already understood what would be said. And then also, there's not really much fanfare around it either, because there's so much else happening in the U.S. that, it's pretty much a blip. So I didn't even know they had all of this detailed propaganda going. But it plays along with the way that Biden is also trying to rewrite the Americas, or the Latin America and the Caribbean, as the front yard, as if that's supposed to be a step away from the Monroe Doctrine, and not a double downing of it. Because that entire first year, we watched no safety nets for TPS, support of Jovenel Moise, the recognizing of Ariel Henry, so which I think is interesting because he was invited to go, and I can't tell you who voted for him. And he's also like, I think, being accused of having assassinated Moise, but he was allowed, he was invited. That's democracy for the U.S. The consistent agitating of Cuba from accusing the medical brigade of sex trafficking, refusing to take them off the state-sponsored terrorist list, the additional sanctions, Kamala's telling Guatemalans do not come here. The budgeting for ICE has exploded. The press secretary is still recognizing Guaido, who, by the way, just recently got busted up. So that's a highlight. That's a good day for us all. But yeah, so we're watching the Biden administration double down on that racist Monroe Doctrine, policy-wise. The support of the OAS, the core group, SOUTHCOM, Extension. I mean, even when Haiti had the earthquake, they sent SOUTHCOM, Samantha Powers in SOUTHCOM. So I think that it's really important for us to understand that, because I think even with the front yard jargon, he's trying to move away from, I guess, what he thinks that Trump did, or trying to make it like Trump was such a bad president. Look what he did. But none of those policies that Trump enacted has he stopped, especially Title 42. So, and I think in fact it's gotten worse under Biden. So when we look at the summit and a summit for democracy, we have to recognize the hypocrisy of the U.S., especially when it comes to that region, and especially when it comes to our Americas. So we talk about colonization there, we have to recognize it here as well.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's something that is very important to raise, connecting the resistance against SOUTHCOM and Wall Street with the gains of our class and our peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I was also interested in seeing, it was a big win as well for Venezuela, because at the same time you had President Nicolas Maduro in Iran signing a 20-year deal with the Islamic Revolution of Iran, which I am a supporter of. And I think that Iran is doing amazing things, even though they're not socialist per se. They're resisting empire in very key ways, and have been in support of not only Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, but of Zimbabwe, of Angola, of Mozambique. And Iran is doing some really amazing work. So that was a win for Venezuela. And also what Comrade Erica mentioned as well, and we are going to play, I think it's on World Star Hip Hop, the Guaido video. No, it's not World Star Hip Hop. It's like the Latin American version of World Star Hip Hop. This is Guaido getting fucked up and attacked. I don't know if you guys can see this. Hold on. Yeah, in the corner. Let's see. So this is him. I actually just heard about this a few minutes ago. Hold on, let me see if I can find him. Yeah, this is him. This is him in the corner. Yeah, this is him right here. He's getting fucking pushed around, getting shit thrown at him. He got shoved. This is in Venezuela. And this is, this is the people this is the guy that the U.S. claims is the president. And now they completely stopped. The U.S. came back crawling to Venezuela and was like, yo, can we get some oil? And as Ill State Fishing said, that Gusano got what he deserved. Guaido is clearly not popular, clearly not the president. So the U.S. very quickly got off of that bandwagon. Before we go to Comrade Salifu, I do want to share the video, an amazing video from BAP, the What is SOUTHCOM? And we'll talk a little bit more about the threat of U.S. imperialism militarily, not only financially, but militarily in the region, and the threat that it poses for our nation. So I'm going to play this and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
The police, the prison system, the law.
It's no secret that these institutions intentionally crush and terrorize Black and oppressed people within the U.S. But the brutal violence the U.S. military inflicts on colonized Black and brown people
is often hidden from our view. Even though the U.S. military is the largest and most expensive of any country, by far.
We have new, beautiful equipment that comes along with $2.5 trillion in spending, all made in the USA.
The U.S. military has literally divided the earth into 11 areas of responsibility, each patrolled by a different command.
The U.S. Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, polices one of these areas of responsibility. The SOUTHCOM region covers 15 million miles
and represents about 1/6 of the landmass of the world. Headquartered in Miami, U.S. Southern Command includes 32 countries, 19 in Central and South America and 13 in the Caribbean.
And that's not to mention 16 U.S. colonies like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which don't have political independence as sovereign states and are not represented in the U.S. government.
SOUTHCOM grew out of the U.S. military occupation of Panama in the first decade of 1900. This was when the U.S. government built the Panama Canal to secure trade routes for its elite and business class. It was established during World War II, originally under the name Caribbean Defense Command,
and formalized the government's control over the Caribbean, which had begun decades prior during the Panama invasion. Now, SOUTHCOM has at least 4 bases in the region, including Guantanamo Bay in Cuba.
The U.S. military uses its bases in Honduras and El Salvador as access points to reach other strategic locations, such as Nicaragua, Venezuela and Colombia, and Guatemala.
Joint exercises and military-to-military contact programs between the United States and regional militaries are a major aspect of SOUTHCOM's activities.
While SOUTHCOM says these military operations promote security cooperation,
we built that team, we built that camaraderie,
build regional partnerships, and strengthen democratic principles. In reality, SOUTHCOM programs have supported dictatorial regimes and militarized governments in the region.
Like that of Papa and Baby Doc, who ruled Haiti in the late 1950s until the mid-1980s.
And the Colombian government, which right now is killing indigenous and African-descended human and land rights activists.
These governments do the bidding of the U.S. by economically exploiting their own country for the benefit of U.S. corporations and by squashing popular rebellion.
As natural disasters and political crises, including the U.S.-led war on drugs, escalated in the 1990s, SOUTHCOM activity increased.
Good evening. This is the first time since taking the oath of office that I felt an issue was so important, so threatening, that it warranted talking directly with you, the American people. All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs. Tonight, I'm announcing a strategy that reflects the coordinated, cooperative commitment of all our federal agencies.
Every year, SOUTHCOM uses humanitarian assistance exercises and disaster response efforts as military training platforms.
But instead of stemming drug flows and feeding the poor, SOUTHCOM's true goal is to destabilize socialist countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, as well as disrupt Latin American and Caribbean nations' relationship with Russia, China, and Iran.
The absolute urgency with which we have to maintain our competitive edge in this region, increasingly contested strategic space in the global competition with China and Russia. And we do maintain our positional advantage here. However, that advantage is eroding, and it's challenging our ability to maintain the favorable balance of regional power directly called for here in this hemisphere in the National Defense Strategy.
The Black Alliance for Peace stands against the growing influence and power of SOUTHCOM and its ever-increasing militarization of the region.
We demand the end of SOUTHCOM and call for a zone of peace in Latin America and the Caribbean. in which the people's right to self-determination is realized.
And conflicts between nations are resolved peacefully. No compromise, no retreat.
Amazing video. Again, shout out to the comrades from Black Alliance for Peace. A great job explaining.
Shout out to Jelani.
Shout out to Jelani.
Jelani produced that, so.
Wow.
And Comrade Rebecca.
And Comrade Rebecca. That's amazing. And also shout out to Comrade Chris, who's in the chat, Warms My Heart. Chris also had an amazing presentation in LA talking about the importance of opposing, in particular Haiti as well, raising the case of Haiti and opposing any U.S. presence, because the U.S. Never solves problems in our nations. It always exacerbates them. And shout out to everybody else who's watching. To Manny, Nile, no compromise, no retreat. Comrade Salifu, you had a great presentation at the workshop last week talking about the central role of anti-colonialism and decolonizing nations away from imperialism, and why this is so central. Because one of the common tropes is that within the anti-imperialist camp, whenever there are contradictions that take place within nations, like in Cuba, for example, remnants of racism or remnants of homophobia, the white liberals like to zoom in and focus on that and write their New York Times articles saying how backward Cuba is and this and that. You know, what is your take on the central role of decolonization when we're talking about Latin America and the Caribbean and African peoples, indigenous peoples?
Yes, so this is one of my favorite things to talk about, as you can tell, because I feel like in the US, when we talk about decolonization, it's always some like fluffy, flowery thing that's like about like decolonize academia or whatever. And it's because people don't actually understand what colonization is. People don't actually understand colonialism or what it means to be like a colonized person, right? And so when you're talking about colonialism, like you're talking about material scientific processes that have to undergo. These things take a long time. People have to like fight and die and rewrite constitutions and redraw maps and boundaries and territories. Like all of these things are a part of the process of decolonization. And what happens in the US a lot of times is that global northers in the West, I'll say in general, believe that because we have this like super flowery academic idea of what decolonization is, that it's not in practice anywhere else. And it's like, no, there are decolonial projects that exist in the world today where people are actively sweating every day, like suffering, working, building toward the process of like decolonization. And so again, like I mentioned, people don't actually understand what colonialism is, so people don't understand what it means to be like a colonized person. This is one of the things that me and Erica talk about all the time, because there's this thing that happens in our own communities where like people are just like this, like I guess we can call it disposability politics. When people aren't perfect, when they don't have all the perfect principles and values, you just like throw them away. That happens like on a very small scale in our communities, but we see it happen on a larger scale when we talk about nations like Cuba, for example. People are looking at Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua with like a microscope, looking for any remnant of anything reactionary to be like, see, I told y'all it wouldn't work. It can't work. But people do that again because they do not understand colonization. Like they don't understand what colonialism is. They don't understand what it means to be like a colonized person, right? And so because we understand racism as a byproduct of colonization, right? Like I feel like we've gotten really far away from understanding what racism is. Racism is the systems and structures that were created to justify colonialism. That's why it's racism. It's a system. We're talking about the field of science, psychology, media, all these things that rose to give credence to what the Western world, what the white world had done all around the world, right? So in order to defeat those things, to defeat things like racism, you have to defeat colonization. And so when we talk about Cuba and we talk about the Cuban Revolution, we're talking about a revolution that is ongoing and has been ongoing for years. Like, I mean, we can point back to 1959, but we can go back even further than that to like the slave revolts in Cuba. right? This is like a 100-year long process of decolonization on that very island. And so in that process, in that attempt toward decolonization, they've gotten very far. Like they've gotten really far. Like you don't even really have to go there to see it. You can read about it, but when you go there, you can see it. They've gotten really far to an extent that it would be unrecognizable to a lot of people in the US, to a lot of people in the global north. It doesn't seem real to people. It didn't seem real to me the first time that I was in Cuba and I was talking to people who in the US would be considered white, who were telling me that they were African, like they felt Africa in their heart, that everything about who they were was African. And there's no way that you can tell them that they're not. It's because of that long process of decolonization. It sounds fake to so many people, but you have to, like, when you see it and you experience it, you realize that colonization is not the end all be all of the planet. It's not the end all be all of the world. Anything that's been done can be undone, right? Colonization has been done. It's happened to us, yes, but it can be undone. And so when we talk about revolutionary projects in the global South, we talk about revolutionary projects in the Middle East, when we talk about revolutionary projects in Asia, we're talking about projects that are trying to undo that process of colonization. The US left has to get out of people's way and allow them to and aid them, right? And actually help and learn from them so that we can actually decolonize in practice, not just in like theory where we like write on Blogspot about it. So yeah.
Always bringing that fire. Comrade Salifu always has that amazing analysis, and I couldn't agree more. And shout out to Comrade Chris Duran as well, being funny in the chat. Quote, decolonize nonprofits, decolonize entrepreneurship. And I saw one time on social media, it was like decolonization. That cracked me up too. And it's so true. It's like people have to understand. I always say that, for example, in the case of Cuba, that when we talk about homophobia or transphobia or racism, it's not a product of socialism, but it's a product of centuries of colonization. And until you begin to change the mode and means of production, until you transition away from the capitalist mode of production and build socialism in conjunction with fighting racism and educating the masses with socialist politics and scientific socialism, you can't begin to eradicate these problems overnight. And I think that's the biggest difference between the anarchists and the communists, where the anarchists and a lot of the ultra leftists who oppose these nations like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and use the left veneer to support imperialism, they think you get a magic wand when you take power. They think that when you take power, you get a little magic wand and you just wave it and you get your dream society on day one, and that's it. And if somebody says something that's problematic, or if somebody does something that's problematic, after that, then we shouldn't support it at all. And this is a very idealist way of understanding socialism. And this goes back as far back as Engels talking about socialism, utopian, and scientific, where scientific socialism is about understanding socialism as a dialectical development. Like in Bolivia, the movement toward socialism, they're building social. It's a process that takes place over many years. And it's very hard to do that when the fucking global economy is strangling you, right? And that was my critique as well. A lot of white leftists who critique Mugabe and Zimbabwe, they were like, oh, look, like he nationalized everything and he gave back the land and they didn't do anything. Like they're horrible and they're violating human rights. And it's like, dude, like, do you know, first of all, Zimbabwe's landlocked. Second of all, they've been fucking sanctioned like crazy. And Zimbabwe has not gotten the support or solidarity that other nations have gotten, just to be real, like in terms of international support. Black anti-imperialist nations in particular get fucking hit hard, African nations, even if we're talking about Libya too. Like I remember being one of the few people at the solidarity with Gaddafi rallies in 2011 when they murdered him and overthrew the Jamahiriya. So it's not even just me. Shout out to the comrades in Harlem. This particular group, I forget their names, but there was this group from Harlem, a Pan-African group. They were like something December. I forgot what they were called. But they hit me up about it. They were like, yo, let's go to these Libya rallies in defense. We had the green flag. and it was very few of us. And there was like these white Trotskyites who were like, "You're supporting a bourgeois dictatorship and this and that," and so it's just like people have such a premature and also racist view of socialism in the global South. You know, anytime Black and brown communists do something, they're just tyrants and dictators. But if fucking Bernie Sanders or Sweden does something, then they're like, oh my God, they're like these heroes. But Comrade Carlos, you know, your analysis of all of this, the role of colonization in Latin America and the Caribbean, and why don't you also talk a little bit about the development of Marxism in Latin America and Latin American characteristics, because there's a lot going on there. You write a lot about this and talk about this, in particular with like Bolivia and other nations. Why don't you get into that?
Well, I really enjoy the points that you guys have touched, especially on the focus of process. In my work, I try to call it a purity fetish, and I try to trace it back to ancient Greek philosophy, which in the philosophy of Parmenides tries to consider what is true, which in Greece is always connected to the good, right? To that which is pure. And I see that as the predominant sort of metaphysical tendency, the way of looking at the world that has came down through all of Western philosophy. And it's, of course, in Western Marxism, right? And so what I try to do in my work is show how this purity fetish makes it so that when Marxists or socialists in general in the West analyze projects in the global South or in the East that are fighting for socialism, because they don't hit the standards of purity, because they don't check off every point on the checklist, they reject them in total. And that's a massive mistake, because it fails to consider how socialism is born, as Marx said in the Critique of Gotha program, with the birthmarks of capitalism. And all the flaws of capitalism are incorporated in the beginning of the socialist process. And it's a process of overcoming those flaws and continuously fighting against them. I don't know if my signal's bad. I see some of you frozen, but it's a continuous process of fighting against that. And with the topic of colonialism and the remnants of that, what capitalism tries to do in its first stage in order to develop, it needs this process that we call primitive accumulation, where in Europe, the way it looks like, the way it appears is by kicking all the peasants from the commons and clearing out land for capital to be able to take root in those lands. But this process happens as well abroad. It starts in 1492 in the Americas, and it realizes that since it doesn't have labor to super exploit, because the indigenous are fighting back and they can't be, they just can't use them, they go to Africa and they start kidnapping people as slaves. And so this whole process tears cultures apart, or tries to, in order to perpetuate the ideology of bourgeois individualism, which makes it easier for people to be pitted against one another and to not realize the sort of collective interest that they have in fighting against the existing order. And one of the things that Jose Carlos Mariátegui used to emphasize in Peru is that regardless of how much they've tried to imbue individualism on the indigenous communities there, they have always sustained what he called a communistic ethos, which has always helped it in the struggle against capitalism and in the struggle against imperialism. And what we see now in, for instance, Bolivia, is that Marxism is being combined with these traditional indigenous outlooks, which are very communistic. And, you know, in our tradition of Marxism is what we would call primary communism. They already have a communistic spirit. So it makes the struggle against capitalism a whole lot easier when you don't have to overcome some of the individualism that you have in the West that permeates certain working class communities. But yeah, I think that recognizing also that the sort of bourgeoisification of the struggles for Black liberation, for sexual liberation, for the struggle of women that we've seen over the last decade or two, really, I've seen it really intensified over the last 5 years. But if we look at some of the propaganda that's being used in order to attack the countries that exist outside of the spheres of influence of imperialism, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, it's all somehow, especially in the mainstream newspapers that are left-wing according to the existing capitalist order, it's all somehow tied to the phenomenon that, you know, for lack of a better word, we've been calling wokeism, right? Wokeism. So Maduro must be opposed because he is doing so-and-so to LGBTQ people. We had actually a few weeks ago, we had a prominent left-wing paper. I can't remember if it was The Nation or The Guardian, but they reached out to Eddie to ask him about why he supports, as a leftist, Venezuela when they're treating sexual minorities bad. And so they did this whole thing, this whole article condemning Maduro on the basis of how he treats sexual minorities. They did the same thing in July 11th in the protest with Cuba. The narrative, specifically from the left wing of imperialism, was that they were repressing Black artists. And they've done the same thing in Nicaragua with women's struggles. And it comes from this purity fetish that fails to realize that these negative parts that we see in the socialist project are something we're fighting against, and that it's a process that takes a long time to get rid of, because it took a long time to imbue people's minds with these wretched forms of looking at the world and of classifying people as inferior or superior. And the structures that, as Comrade Salifu emphasized, the structures that were put in place in order for these ideologies to disseminate, they took a long time to hegemonize. And it's going to take a long time to overcome them, especially when you're still in a global order dominated by capitalist imperialism, and you're constantly having to fight against imperialist pressure from outside and the sort of funding of dissident groups inside. And under these conditions, some things get deprioritized, and we can't point at those things in which there's still work to be done and reject the whole project because they're imperfect. That's the sort of epitome of a Eurocentric metaphysics that I think is permeated in the left, and that I think in the work that we all do, we try to fight against.
Beautifully said, compañero. Yeah, I think that's right on. I think that a lot of times the logic and the frame of mind that a lot of these purity fetishists have is looking at something as isolated, static, and not as a form of motion. And this is central. This is why it's important to really study dialectics and have a Marxist understanding of reality, because if you don't have the science of Marxism, the science of dialectics in mind when looking at phenomena and reality, you're not going to be able to properly assess it. For example, if we're judging or assessing or critiquing a movement, if we look at it is in its static form, if we just look up the Wikipedia page, and this is what a lot of people do in the US, they look up, they're like, okay, let's see this party. Let me Wikipedia it, look it up, look up the name. What is their ideology? What do they believe? Oh, they're horrible. That's it. They don't see it as an evolution, a motion that's moving towards something or away from something. And it's something that really hinders a lot of people in the imperial core nations, where they're just unable to understand that things are constantly moving and changing. Even groups, even popular support for certain things are changing throughout the regions. Like, for example, in Eurasia, you have the rise of a new ideology like Eurasianism that blends Orthodox Christianity with Marxism, Leninism, with some elements of conservatism. And maybe in the West, we don't understand that, but that's something that they're figuring out over there. And we have to have the humility and not the arrogance to properly understand and study that. But Comrade Erica, just to kind of wrap up here, what are your thoughts on the use of, because this seems to be so efficient for the left wing of imperialism, as Carlos was saying, like appropriating these struggles, because obviously, like I support like LGBTQ liberation, I support all oppressed peoples being uplifted, but the people who are doing so under capitalism, they're attacking the anti-imperialist nations on this front where their contradictions exist. So what are some of the best ways to avoid these pitfalls, and any examples of people kind of falling for that stuff?
I think where we see that the most, or where we see that occurring the most, are people who have no actual engagement with the country, or people who are actually living in the country. Most of the time, they're in conversations with diaspora who are already influenced by this nation, so they already have a particular viewpoint about human rights, which are individualized bourgeois rights. They're not people-centered rights, which is a lot of the things that BAP tries to promote, there's a distinction between a people-centered human rights and bourgeois individual rights. And I think that when you are in conversation with diaspora, especially, and that calls for a lot of the xenophobic attitudes too, because a lot of the times diaspora are not migrants. They are coming here willingly. They are coming here with a significant income or wealth, or at least enough home that they can manage here. So when people are introduced to those type of things, then they have an idea of what these countries are, despite these people not living the material reality of the folks who are still in those countries, who are still under sanctions in those countries, who are still regulated by the U.S. under those countries, whether by OAS or core group or SOUTHCOM or any of the soft or hard power entities like NED or USAID that are like strongholding their ability to liberate themselves or to move their processes further along. So when you see those folks come over here and they have words about socialism, when they have words about, it's because they're coming from a particular class element, one, but then also they have been propagandized the same way we've been propagandized in this nation. We talked about Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, but I remember a couple decades ago, 30 years ago, was Grenada, Nicaragua, and Cuba for those same reasons. And a lot of what Maurice Bishop talked about was the way the propaganda works in this country. Like having only come to New York one time and just being in awe that he's surrounded by, just what the New York Times says, the billboards. It's nothing like when we see Revolutionary Grenada, the type of billboards that were on there that advocated for literacy, that advocated for, not just education, but women's rights and things like that. That's not the propaganda that you noted in the U.S. So I think it's very, very important to understand those distinctions, especially when we talk about diaspora, who have a very loud voice in the room. Because it's not just Cubans that have to deal with that. When you look at Haitians, the Haitian diaspora, they have a little too much say, probably, in things that they're not actually dealing with day to day. So I think that having discernment, making sure joining organizations that have these connections, joining brigades, going to these countries and seeing for yourselves, having conversations, being and trying to build a community with these folks, you get a better understanding. I know for sure Salifu's a lot different since coming back from Cuba. It's a different perspective when you go and when you see and when you're able to talk to folks. Because I myself haven't been able to go, but I have been in conversation with folks that gives me a different perspective, that things are not so one-to-one as we would like them to be.
Most definitely. I couldn't agree more. I suggest people go to socialist countries, go to these nations. I have tried to go to Cuba 4 times at this point. Every time something has come up, either the delegation gets canceled or I couldn't go, or I don't know, something the universe does not want me to go to Cuba. But someday I will go. I have been to Nicaragua. Me and Ophelia went to Nicaragua. We've been to China as well. China, I highly suggest people go to China. It's beautiful, and seeing socialism alive and well, despite what the ultras say. The People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of China, is very much practicing Marxism and practicing socialism of the 21st century. Go to Venezuela, even go to countries like Haiti that are resisting empire, that are on the forefront. Some of the most militant protests, I think the most militant protest I've ever been to was in Haiti in 2019, when a lot of the uprisings were going up. I went to Haiti twice that year, and seeing the protests with my own eyes, there was no cell phone in sight. Like, it wasn't like these whack ass fucking liberal protests in the US where people are like the whole time taking selfies and shit with the blowhorn. Like, people, nobody had their phones. People had fucking machetes in the air. Like, it was like so inspiring. I can't even begin to explain. People had pictures of like Dessalines, pictures of Aristide fighting against the Moise government. It was beautiful, beautiful. Go to Haiti, go see what resistance looks like up in front. Go to countries that have liberated themselves. I would love someday to go to Angola, Mozambique, to Zimbabwe as well, because I also think that the socialist projects on the African continent do not get any love or support. And that's a shame, honestly, because there's so much to learn from these movements. And so I think, like Erica said, like go to these countries, like learn and talk to people, because it will change you. You will develop a personal connection with those movements, and your soul in a way heals. Because I don't know about you guys, but like being in the US is so fucking depressing, especially if you're the only communist in your area or neighborhood. And it's like so isolating sometimes, and going somewhere and being with like-minded people in a space that's liberated, there's something so beautiful about it that I can't even begin to explain. And I'm glad that Comrade Erica mentioned one of my favorite revolutionaries of all time, somebody who does not get a lot of attention and love, Maurice Bishop. This is a quote: "As the international capitalist crisis intensifies, it generates increased imperialist aggression, spearheaded by the most reactionary circles of imperialism's military-industrial complexes, who feel that the solution to this crisis in the buildup of arms, the provocation of wars, and the creation of tension spots around the world." And the original Troika resistance, Grenada, Nicaragua, and Cuba in the late 70s, early 80s. New Deal movement, again, a very important scientific socialist movement to study. Comrade Salifu, any final thoughts from you on the decolonization of our America, the decolonization of led by African and indigenous peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean, and any final comments on that?
Yeah, I just want to say that one of the biggest things I feel like as a part of our work as Pan-Africanists, Erica and I, we are very clear about the fact that African people, and I'm going to come back to why I'm saying African, but African, some of us like to call ourselves Black. None of us can be free anywhere in the world as long as Africa is subjugated and controlled by Western powers like France, Britain, the United States, so on and so forth. Africa has to be free and it has to be united. And the reason why that has to be the case is because it is our homeland. We cannot afford general confusion about, whether we are African people or not. We are Africans living in the Americas, and this generic idea of like one America, Americans, is not real. It's not scientific. It's not based on history or geography. We live in a region of the world called the Americas. There's a North America, there's a Central America, there's a South America. So one of the things that we are working really hard with in the Black Alliance for Peace and the All African People's Revolutionary Party is making sure that we use that word African more in communication and in contact with our people, because it's important for us to see ourselves as African. When we talk about the Americas, when we talk about the decolonization of the Americas, it's important that Africans in Nicaragua, the Africans in Cuba, the Africans in Haiti, the Africans in Barbados, the Africans in Jamaica see ourselves as African people who have been trafficked to this hemisphere of the world through the process of colonization and chattel slavery. That is why we exist in this hemisphere of the world and not in our homeland, right? And we have to see ourselves as African because something is happening in the Americas right now. There's a battle that is happening between socialism and progressive people's movements rising and fascism rising. And we see that not just on the far right, but there's also this issue I feel that needs to be addressed hardcore in the US left of like patriotic socialism. Those people terrify me. I have no idea what actually to do with that, because it's like it's just bound with contradictions that I don't think are making space for African people that can make space for African people on a land that needs to be decolonized. So we have to be able to recognize each other. We have to be able to see each other. We have to be able to communicate with each other, plan with each other, and that has to be shit. That can't just be through the basis of like some identity imposed upon us because of the color of our skin. Somebody else said we were Black, so we're Black people now. We came to this hemisphere of the world as Africans. We're leaving as Africans. That is our shared identity. That is what we organize around. And so as long as I remain in this hemisphere of the world, I love the Americas, but I'm an African that wants to die in Africa one day. But as long as I'm in this hemisphere of the world, I feel that has to be a crucial and important part of the work. So when we talk about decolonizing the Americas, right, we're talking about also tethering ourselves away from this hyphenation of American and questioning what is that? What America are you talking about? African American, what America are you talking about? Does that apply to the Africans in Venezuela? Does that apply to the Africans in, can Jamaicans call themselves African Americans? What America are you talking about? So that is the question that Black Alliance for Peace and organizations like All African People's Revolutionary Party are asking to our people in this moment as we're talking about decolonizing the Americas.
Well said. Damn, Comrade Salifu, always having amazing comments. So much amazing stuff. I definitely agree with you. I think me personally, I don't identify as quote American. I think that there are many issues with that label. And I like the fact that as we have this discussion, we can reference all of these things in a comradely way and in a very scientific way. Because a lot of times people will, especially I find this in particular with a lot of the first world leftists, like in particular, people get so caught up in parties and little cliques and beefs and stuff that people disconnect it from the real world and real world issues, and it becomes more of like these ego driven fucking dramas. And and I personally hate that shit. And that's why I like talking to you comrades about this, because you guys are all very mature and scientific, and unfortunately that's a big problem on the left. I think that in Latin America and Caribbean in particular, you have to recognize African and indigenous liberation first and foremost. We can't talk about liberation of Brazil without talking about African liberation. And Africans in Brazil are part of the broader African diaspora, and that has to be addressed. The same way in Bolivia, you can't talk about socialism and workers' rights without talking about indigenous liberation. And that's just part and parcel of it. And there are some sectors who will say, oh, well, that's race reductionist, right? And then conversely, there are also people who maybe on the more liberal side who only focus on race. When you talk about Marxism and socialism, they say that's class reductionist. So we're kind of contending with these two different tendencies within the left. And that's why I look to the politics of Walter Rodney. I look to the politics of Maurice Bishop. I look to the politics of Evo Morales, who understood that, yes, these contradictions exist. And even in Venezuela, for example, you'll have Afro-Venezuelans, African Venezuelans who identify with Africa and consider themselves African, but then they'll still uphold someone like Simon Bolivar, who identified as Pan-American or a different concept, right? And so I always take my cues from what our Global South comrades are doing, in particular, people of oppressed nations. And I think this is an amazing discussion to have. This is an ongoing discussion. And I want to continue this more, because I think you guys have a lot of great feedback. And like for me personally, as a Honduran, as somebody whose nation was destroyed and pillaged by the United States, I can never call myself an American. Like that's just not, I just can't do that. But that being said, I'll talk to people who maybe embrace that identity. And I also think it's so important as communists to have discussions with different tendencies and different people, because we're not evangelical Christians. Going back to a compañero Carlos was saying, like the purity fetishism, like we're not evangelical Christians, we're scientific socialists. And we have to contend with these different tendencies and study them well to be able to have a proper analysis. So, you guys have really insightful comments. Compañero Carlos, any last words that you want to say before we head out?
Well, yeah, I've appreciated listening to all of you. I think specifically the final comments from both of you were excellent. One of the things that's often underlooked is the fact that when Marx says that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, he doesn't say class struggle. There isn't just one, it's class struggle. And that's something that Domenico Losurdo, a prominent, I think, in my opinion, one of the best Marxist-Leninist theoreticians of the last half a century, he emphasizes it in his book by the same name, Class Struggles, that Marxists don't have this reduction of class to just this one battle. We understand class as just a group's alignment to a specific form of production, which means that in different times, things like nationhood, things like sex, things like race come to the forefront as themselves class struggle. And so when we understand class struggle like that, these things aren't secondary, right? They're at the forefront because they are forms of class struggles. I think that we're experiencing a very interesting moment. We have a world outside of the capitalist imperialist world order that is uniting in its struggle against imperialism. We're seeing that more and more consistently over the last 2, 3, 4 years. And we still have the election, hopefully, of Petro in Colombia. And then in October, we have Lula, who has mentioned that he is thinking about perhaps creating a new currency. And if that somehow gets instituted through ALBA, it'd be huge in the process of de-dollarization, which of course creates more conditions for autonomy for our people. But at the same time, we have a condition here in the US where the vast majority of working people are struggling and are discontent, and there aren't really many alternatives out there. Some of them have been led towards fascistic routes and the far right, because we know that for the capitalists, they prefer fascism before socialism any day of the week. But I think that at the end of the day, the working classes of the U.S., the oppressed nations, and the working classes of countries that are suffering under capitalist imperialism, their interest is all together in the struggle against monopoly capital, in the struggle against industrial and banking capital, and in the struggle against imperialism. And this is something that I think in our project in Midwestern Marx, we try to emphasize. Probably 95% of the content that we make is anti-imperialist content, debunking imperialist propaganda, and always showing how it is in the interest of workers here in the U.S. to align themselves with these anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, national sovereignty struggles around the world. And I think that at a time of crisis, we know that you can't predict what needs to be there for a revolution to take place, but there's certain elements, there's certain characteristics that we know will be there. And some of them, the main ones are crisis. There needs to be an objective condition of crisis, and there needs to be consciousness. And I think we have that objective condition of crisis. We have it on a perpetual cycle. The living standards in the U.S. are just not good for the vast majority of people. I saw a statistic the other day that half of American workers are a lost paycheck away from homelessness. So these are conditions that are fertile for revolutionary movements and struggles, and we have to take advantage of them and always tie it to the cause of overcoming the capitalist imperialist system, which oppresses not just workers here at home, but abroad as well.
Beautifully said. And final word to Comrade Erica. Your thoughts on all this and any suggestions you have, Erica. You always have really amazing resources for people to learn and study, especially when we're talking about national liberation and African liberation, indigenous liberation. Your final thoughts and any suggestions you have.
Yeah, I do appreciate Salifu noting, why we call ourselves Africans, why we see ourselves as Africans, and what that means politically for our liberation struggle and why it's important. And I also appreciate that Carlos noted that Brazil and Colombia is having 2 important elections because those are majority African nations. So it's important for us to look and see what's happening there, especially with Lula's history. So we're hoping for the best because we know that there are countless Afro-Brazilians that are standing behind him. So we're hoping that turns out. I mean, I think for references, maybe if we're talking about like books and things, things that I look to, always Groundings by Walter Rodney, Maurice Bishop Speaks. There's a book called For the People, but I know that it's like limited print. So I know that Dr. CBS was trying to work out a way to get a PDF. So if that happens, but For the People talks about all of the African liberation struggles from the Caribbean and the continent and the U.S. So folks can get a better sense of how they all lined up. And then I want to recommend Gerald Horne for folks if they have not read the Stellar Apocalypse series. I think it gives an interesting perspective about the foundation and creation of the U.S. and why we consider it a bit of a confusion for Africans to find themselves here. If you understand how the U.S. was created, and on what grounds, on what So I think that Gerald Horne offers a lot in that regard with those 3 books. So I highly, highly recommend it, especially since I learned a significant amount. Also, his book on Cuba was really great, especially for that anti-blackness question. A lot of the things that Salifu talked about things being a process, is really detailed in that book. You really get to see how it, from slave revolts to the revolution, how it unfolded as a process, race in Cuba. So, so those are some things that I could recommend. And then, constant conversation with folks. I think struggle is good. I think we should stop being afraid of struggle. All struggle doesn't have to be antagonistic. And some struggles you lose, but I think you still gain, you still learn a lot from, and I think it's important. And join organizations, because as Carlos mentioned, we are currently living in the U.S. under drastic austerity policies. Like, it's really, and if they're only piling them on as they're sending more money across the Atlantic to Nazis, and like disregarding their own citizens, as they talk about democracy, right, in other countries, or lack of. So I think joining organizations and trying to build power through that way, especially as African and other colonized peoples, it's especially important for us to build independent power outside of the duopoly. So that's all I can offer.
Yeah, most definitely, really great suggestions. All amazing books. Dr. Gerald Horne is a really good dude. I know him personally, and he's a really good guy. Very well read on a lot of topics, and I appreciate that he also has a great contrast between the quote unquote independence movements in Latin America and the Caribbean and the United States, because unfortunately, one of the things that happens is that people will look at Latin American and Caribbean countries and their quote unquote independence movements, and heroes like Jose Marti and Simon Bolivar and others, right? Bernardo Higgins, other independence heroes of Latin America and the Caribbean, and they'll copy and paste that logic onto the United States without understanding that there's a completely different trajectory of history when we're talking about Cuban nationalism, for example, or Brazilian nationalism or Haitian nationalism with the U.S., which is not a nation, but an empire, settler colonial empire. And so I think his books do a great job at kind of contrasting that, talking about the differences, right? Because there is a difference. Walter Rodney, of course, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, one of my personal favorites, and so many others. And I think it's important. We have to challenge ourselves to actually read Marxist works by African and indigenous Marxists and communists, and not just fucking Zizek and whatever. Like, I've learned stuff from them too, but it's like we have to kind of like really dig deep into what our peoples are writing about these topics, because that'll provide an analysis that is very different from what we'll get in Barnes and Noble or the cafes of fucking New York and shit. Because I know I went to NYU, and shout out to Comrade Chris Duran, by the way, who's in the chat. Every country has its own conditions, just every community within the U.S. does. Me and him always joke around about the soy socialist latte leftists at NYU. So it's been great having you guys on, man. I really appreciate the work that each and every one of you do. You guys are awesome. I'd love to have you guys back on in the future to have a broader discussion about the left in the U.S., seeing as all of us are in some way or another part of these different movements, a part of these different activist spaces that are resisting empire and imperialism. How do we unite the anti-imperialist left? How do we have these conversations, as you guys mentioned, like in talking about contradictions and antagonisms? Like, it doesn't always have to be this huge fucking blowout, And it's like, I think it's important to have conversations about disparities and differences in how we look at what even would socialism in the Americas look like. So I really appreciate having you guys on. You guys are awesome. We had comrades Erica Caines, Salifu Mack, and Carlos Garrido. Please support Black Alliance for Peace. They are doing amazing work. I'm a paid member as well, Black Alliance for Peace. Please support the All African People's Revolutionary Party, an amazing group. Low Country Action Committee, Liberation Through Reading, which is an amazing program that Erica is involved in. Midwestern Marx, a really great channel, Compañero Carlos is involved with. And also his writings on, especially his videos on Hegel are really fascinating. Somebody who is important to study as Marxist. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you to everybody for watching and listening. Long live the Troika of Resistance in Latin America and the Caribbean, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Long live proletarian solidarity in all countries of the world. Long live the unity of all working class and oppressed peoples. Thank you guys so much. I hope you guys have a great week. We're going to go out to some revolutionary music. Peace out, everybody. Take care.
Yo pregunto a los presentes si no se han puesto a pensar que esta tierra es de nosotros y no del que tenga más. Yo pregunto si en la tierra nunca habrá pensado usted que si las manos son nuestras, es nuestro lo que nos dé. A desalambrar, que la tierra es nuestra, es tuya y de aquel, de Pedro y María, de Juan y José. Si molesto con mi canto a alguien que no quiera oír, le aseguro que es un gringo o un dueño de este país. A desalambrar, que la tierra es nuestra, es tuya y de aquel, de Pedro y María, de Juan y José. A desalambrar, que la tierra es nuestra, es tuya y de aquel, de Pedro y María, de Juan y José.